you're not looking for silver bullets, but you're looking for golden nuggets. And those golden nuggets could come in a failed experiment. They could come in the diagnostics that you do. But there's a permanent need inside institutions and organizations for them to be able to have this capacity to understand human behavior, whether that is the humans that they are inflicting their services on or their products on, or whether it's the human beings that are inside their own organization.
Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. The voice you heard at the beginning was Faisal Naru, who is the founder of Think, Test, Do, a consultancy that helps institutions and people with organizational change, policy and regulatory reform, leadership, and capacity development.
Now, prior to Think, Test, Do, Faisal was the head of strategic management at the OECD and was the executive director of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Now, he's also been a visiting professor at Cambridge and has a long history of contributing great ideas to the applications of behavioral science, including his groundbreaking work on making an inventory of behavioral science consultancies from around the world.
It's great stuff. Now, Kurt and I reconnected with Faisal since we first met during the pandemic in Doha, Qatar at the BX Arabia conference, and we wanted to check in with him on some of his current projects. Now, we featured Faisal in episode 273 back in January of 22, if you want to check that out.
All right, there we go. Yeah, we got together to discuss his recent data on the global explosion of behavioral science policy units around the world, from just a handful in 2010 to over 630 today, Tim. 630 of them.
It's great. I love it. I was particularly struck by Faisal's insight about the difference between global north and the global south approaches to behavioral science. While northern countries often began with small implementation tweaks, southern nations have boldly applied these tools directly to what Faisal calls wicked problems.
Oh man, my East Coast friends are going to love wicked problems by New Englanders, right? There we go. And he makes a compelling case for why behavioral science units need strong ecosystem support, which is another very cool thing. These policy units thrive the most when they connect with academic, private sector partners, and international organizations, rather than just operating on their own little island. There you go.
Yeah, I think
even though they have two, really great musical guests there, they just don't do as well.
That's if they have two great musical guests there.
Okay.
I think our listeners will appreciate Faisal's perspective on the importance of narrative in behavioral work. As Faisal puts it, evidence without a story or narrative are just numbers with no meaning.
Oh, I could not agree more. There you go. So now, sit back and relax with a cup of tea, which you might find out might be Faisal's beverage of choice, and enjoy our conversation on the evolving landscape of behavioral public policy with Faisal Naru.
Faisal Naru, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you very much, Tim and Kurt. A pleasure to be here.
Actually, it's a welcome back. I mean,
it is a welcome back. It is not a welcome. It's not the first time you've been with us. So.
No, I think we met up back in October of 2021 during the pandemic in Doha.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. We did, yeah. And we met in person, which was great.
Yes. During the pandemic. It was pretty amazing. Okay, well, we should get started with the speed round. Faisal, would you prefer coffee or tea?
Oh, well, you can tell from the accent, I like tea. I'm a tea man.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Yeah, life in London has had a positive effect on your consumption of caffeinated fuel, right?
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, actually, I only started drinking coffee after I was about 40 years old. It's very strange. Up until then, I'd never liked coffee, never had it. And then I started to have it purely as an accident, and I felt the benefits. And so since then, I kind of use it every now and again whenever I need to have a boost.
Okay. Tim, there is still hope for you. Tim is not a coffee drinker. He
No,
doesn't
I'm
like the
not.
taste and different things. Actually, when was the last time you actually tasted coffee, Tim?
I was
Oof.
probably like 19.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
see, your taste.
So
You
it's been
should
like
try
20 years.
coffee 20 times 3. But there's hope for you. All right. Well, speed round is not speedy here. All right, Faisal, would you prefer to learn a new instrument or a new language?
Or a new language, definitely. I like
Yes.
traveling around, and learning languages. I think is just so important and so cool.
Yeah.
What
I wish
languages do you
I wish I knew either how to play an instrument or a separate language than English. So I would go for either of them, but that's me,
Faisal,
Yeah.
what languages do you speak?
So properly, I'd say kind of like well, obviously English, but then like Urdu and Punjabi, and then I have lots of kind of broken languages in there because I lived in France, so I have kind of the French. I did Spanish, Arabic. I lived in Vietnam, so I can kind of pick up
Oh
Vietnamese
my gosh.
as well. And then because I've worked in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, so I start to understand a bit of that. So it's kind of, but I find that you kind of have to immerse yourself. And then when you do, slowly it starts to get in there. And once I've worked for a while, I almost don't need interpretation. I understand the gist of the conversation and what's going on, but it takes a bit of time.
Yeah.
Classic underachiever. That's all. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Third speed round question. Faisal, would you agree or disagree with this statement? There are more people today using behavioral economics in policy positions than there were 3 years ago.
I definitely agree. Definitely agree. I'd say that definitely there's a lot more behavioral public policy activity that's going on, more officials, but it's a nuanced story. It's not all rosy, but I think definitely there's the trend is not a trend anymore. It's an established discipline itself.
Wow. Well, we're going to get into some of those nuances later. We have one last question for the speed round, which is the number of agencies working on behavioral science around the world, is that increasing, staying flat, or decreasing?
So since 2018, it's increasing. And I think it still is going to increase, but I think it is going to fluctuate, which means that some don't exist anymore or won't exist, and others will spring up from other places as well.
Mm. Yeah. And again, I think we're going to talk a lot about that as we're moving forward here. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, the three of us, first connected in Qatar in 2021 at BX Arabia. And at that point, you were kind of working on identifying the work of agencies applying behavioral science and behavioral economics in the world of policy. So, just to kind of give us a contrast for those listeners who might not be familiar, what was the state of affairs in 2021? What did the world look like from a behavioral policy perspective?
So I think well, 2021 is quite interesting. I mean, I'd probably go even further back than that. I think that in kind of
That's great.
2000, in I mean, we can even go back from the very beginning, which is that really this whole kind of movement started around kind of 2008. It was the book Nudge was incredibly influential, and lots of kudos to that in terms of popularizing and also getting an understanding of what some of behavioral science can do. And around that time, around kind of 2010, 2012, there's probably a handful of behavioral science units that were out there. Certainly in the United Kingdom, the first one in 2010, and then you had in the United States, in Singapore, in Ireland, and a few other places like Australia and Singapore and South Africa as well. But I think then moving forward after that, and as kind of the movement started to spread, by about 2018 there were 201. So from a
Mm.
handful, you got to 201, and
In
then
pretty short order, really. That's a
really
relatively
short.
short amount of time for that kind of
That's
growth.
right. That's right. And when I mention behavioral public policy units, and I know we'll speak a bit more about this as well, is that this is kind of behavioral public policy entities that are inside or outside of government that are working and applying and contributing towards behavioral public policy activity and towards public policy itself. And I think it's important that that's counted because the story, of course, of how it spread was very much that bridging between academia and the public sector. And
Yeah.
without that kind of support there, that wouldn't have really have happened. So that's kind of been where it was. So then around 2021, you kind of had even more of an explosion going on there. It was probably around 400 then. There was a lot more that was going on, and no surprise, in relation to health. There was a lot of
Mm,
activity going on that was applying the behavioral sciences towards dealing with the pandemic, whether it's immunization or whether it's trying to understand more about how to get people to behave in a particular way, like distancing or whatever else the kind of governments were
Yeah.
doing then. But behavioral science kind of got quite heavy into it there. And I think now, if we fast forward to 2024, there's now 631 is the latest count, give or take. So you can see it's kind of spread and it's been consistently growing throughout the years, which is why I say it's no longer really can be considered as a trend. But there's lots of lessons, I think, in the story of a number of those units, many of whom I've either advised or I'm still advising or I've been involved in. And there's just so much richness there about the variety, diversity, of a lot of the application and how they're all doing really.
So let's get into some of that because I think part of the interesting piece is how this has grown. Obviously, you've talked about, but also how it's shifted. So, what are some of the nuances in today versus, as you mentioned, in 2021? There's a big push on health and a lot of the things that were happening in the world. What's going on today?
So today, I think really what you can see, and you can see that there's lots of activity going on, and really there isn't a policy domain that isn't applying behavioral science.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the shift that you can probably see, which is a good shift, and some would argue, and I'm probably one of those who would argue the shift hasn't happened enough, is that the entree very much was for people to be applying behavioral science in implementation enhancement. Whether it was your classical nudges or whether it was giving information, or even changing kind of some of the choice architecture. I think now what you're seeing, and it's a good sign, is that there's a lot more activity that is beginning to happen in relation to diagnosing the problem in the first instance, understanding, what is the real behavioral drive that is making people do things that maybe, is not good for them or maybe that the government doesn't want them to do. Also, there's also a drive towards doing it more in relation to understanding what worked. So in evaluation, and a good example of this, of course, is the United States Office of Evaluation Services, where there is, a dedicated function that is assessing what federal programs are working and why are they working. But really, the ethos behind all of this is trying to have even greater empirical evidence for better decision making inside public sector bodies. And that, I think, is something that sometimes gets lost, but I think it's worth drawing out that that's really what the business of behavioral public policy should be. It isn't always, but it should be, which is trying to raise the standard of those evidence that is being the basis of decision makers, um, and not necessarily having some of the traditional pieces of evidence being put forward, in order to make decisions. I'll give you a very quick example. Often when sorry, excuse me. Often when policymakers are thinking about, okay, we need to try and do something, which often is stepping into the unknown. It's a new problem. Don't really know how to do it, how to try and address it. Almost the traditional way of trying to understand that is saying, well, let's ask them. Now, what
Mm.
we know from the behavioral sciences is
Yeah,
that's
like a survey kind of a thing. Like
yeah,
if
yeah,
if we just ask the right question, people will tell us the answer, and then we'll just solve it.
yeah, exactly. But of course, what we know that firstly, there's a science behind how you ask them,
Mm.
and depending upon how you ask them, you'll get completely different results. On almost an hourly basis. Um, and
Right.
I think the second thing, of course, is that we kind of assume that people have been thinking about this policy problem as hard as the policy official has, and they kind of know what
Ah.
the answers are going to be. And one of the things that I often say when I'm teaching behavioral science as well, which is that in the difference with the application of behavioral science is that we're not really interested in what people say. We're interested in what they do. We're
Yeah.
interested in what their behavior is actually going to be. So people might say that they're going to go to the gym, but are they going to go to the gym? People might say that they're going to save more for pensions, but are they really going to save more for pensions? And that's
Hmm.
the science that we're trying to bring into the decision making processes inside the public sector.
Are there differences between the focuses of these agencies in the global north compared to the global south?
Yeah, so I'd say that it's very interesting how it's been adopted in the global north and the global south. And I guess, some of my own personal background of, firstly working in the OECD and working with a lot of global north countries, and then going to places like Nigeria and Malaysia and working there in the global south, is that in the global north, I guess there was, and this maybe also has to do with the politics of it, which is that there was probably less ambition to go towards dealing with big problems immediately, and rather starting off with, your quick wins or your implementation tweaks of, how can you improve compliance, whether it's in relation to antibiotics, or whether it's in relation to truancy or things like that. Um, but I think in the global south, there's almost a big appetite to use this on what we've termed, and we've discussed it before, is wicked problems.
Mm.
Is
Yes.
is is that is that almost there's almost a notion that this is a powerful tool, and the why are we using this on tinkering at the edges of maybe issues which might be classed as first world problems, but how are we really going to move the dial on things like poverty? How are we really going to move the dial on things like security, whether that's food security or whether that's other kinds of security?
Right.
And really, the appetite in the global south has very much been more to head towards these wicked problems from the start, from the get go. Not to say that the global north is not doing that, and it's not doing that now. There certainly are big problems that are going on. I mean, I was in Ireland earlier on this week, and they're dealing with around sustainable behaviour, around
Mm.
climate change, around the issues which haven't really been brought to the fore around gambling and the gambling industry and what impact
Wow.
that's having on people. So they are now beginning to, but I think the difference has been in the South, they've just gone straight for it. And they've just said that we need to be applying this on these wicked problems from the get go. And in the global North, that has been a bit of a slower transition.
Is there Do you have any hypothesis on why that is? I mean, is it a cultural component? Is it just because they came at it from a different time or a different perspective? Where do you, or is it the nature of the governments themselves that their global north has been established for a long time, and maybe not so much in some of the global south components? Just your thoughts.
No, it's an excellent question. I think that there's a few things. I think the first thing is that you can't ignore the political contexts and the political cultures there. That the appetite for how far you use the behavioral sciences varies. Even in the global north, it varies.
Yeah.
In certain parts of the world, there's freedom of choice is absolute king, and you can't touch that. And so, therefore, you're more around this space of how do we try and change the choice architecture. But then, if you go to other parts of the world, like in Europe, that's absolutely fine. Limiting choice is completely legitimate from a behavioral perspective and from a political perspective. So politics has a lot to do with it in terms of what is the political appetite for applying this and how far can you go. And I'm sure you've heard all these terms of, nudge and boost and nudge plus and et cetera, et cetera. So different places have different appetites for how far to go with the behavioral sciences. So I think that's kind of the first issue. I think the second issue is very much about how the behavioral sciences were introduced into those particular jurisdictions. What were the expectations? And I think this in itself, and this is some of the work that I've done very recently in a paper that I authored, was the expectations is still a critical issue for a number of behavioral units. That if they are set up in a particular way where they are supposed to have a certain, I don't know, return on investment, or they're supposed to do a certain number of experiments in the year, etc., compared to a more outcome focused unit, which is we need to just crack the problem and we need to just throw the science at it. That has kind of determined the difference between where you then go. Then, do you then go towards the smaller, implementation tweaks? And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just kind of reflecting what's going on in the world. But whereas I think in the global south, they were kind of like, well, why are we tinkering at the edges? Let's just crack onto it and let's just have a look at, well, how can we address things like, youth safety or youth violence or extremism or domestic violence or things like that. And let's start really getting to the crux of the matter. Partly also because we don't have the resources to tinker at the edges. We need to just crack the main problem, right? So there's kind of a variance there.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that you just described that, it reminded me of my own consulting work, right? When I get brought in to do X type of work, then I get branded as you're the communication people, or you're this. When I'm going, but we also do these other facets over here. But it's very hard then to break through in order to get to do the other type of work, because you've been seen as, and kind of your initial charter has been around whatever that would be, X. And it feels like what you're saying is that's partly what, if, depending upon how the behavioral science unit was brought in, if it's brought in to do, as you said, work on the edges or work on those wicked problems, then you're going to be doing that. So, and I think it's always easier too to start big and then spread out to the edges versus start at the edges and try to get big into that piece. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think also, and this is something else that was brought out from kind of the recent research that I did, which is that a surprise for me when looking at the different functions that the various different units are doing. And I did kind of a deep dive of 10 and tried to get, a cross body representation from the global south, global north, newer bodies, older bodies. And yes, the number one function that they all had was around kind of policy experimentation. But the other things that were really high up on their agenda that they had to continue doing, and these were even those that have been around for 10, 15 years, was that they had to continue to do awareness raising and capacity building. And that goes to your point, Kurt, which is that the whole notion of behavioral science and nudging, it's such an easily, intuitively kind of easy thing to understand, but also not to really understand what it means as well.
Right, exactly.
So it's quite easy for senior leadership to read an article and say, yeah, this is perfect, this is what we're going to do, but not really get it. And so what you find even today is that a large proportion of time of a number of those behavioral public policy bodies to now, they are still trying to raise awareness and correct that understanding that we're not just doing implementation tweaks, which are important. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that, but there's so much more to offer as well. And particularly around the diagnostics and just understanding what is going on in the first instance. It's just such an important part that the science can really bring, and that has been brought in a number of different areas.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Faisal. This recent research, because you outlined it in a paper in Behavioral Science Policy Journal recently, and we'll have a link to it in the notes. But I think that the title is "Behavioral Public Policy Bodies: New Developments and Lessons." And one of the things that really struck us was this idea of you talk about the ecosystem and the importance of the ecosystem. First of all, what do you mean by ecosystem, and why is this? Second part is, why is this so important in the formation and execution of public policy?
So there's a few reasons why. I think the first reason why the ecosystem is so important, it tells the story of how behavioral science came into public policy in the first instance, which is what I was mentioning a bit before, which is that it really was the bridge and the meeting of this whole wealth of knowledge, of methods, of rich academic rigor that had been going on for decades, and it being introduced towards public policymakers. And that bridge meant that there was a flow of these new ideas, these new insights, and that's why in lots of places it was called behavioral insights, that could help policymakers understand better a lot of the problems that they were trying to address, which they weren't really managing to move the dial on or be able to address. And had it not been for that partnership between, in the early days, it was very much between academia and the public sector. And of course, lots of eminent scholars were around and were advising governments, then we wouldn't be here where we are right now. But even still, it's important to have that ecosystem to be supporting those behavioral public policy bodies, because they do need that constant support, not just in relation to the policies that they're doing at the moment, and if, for want of a better word, but having the latest technology in terms of policy making and the knowledge that's out there, so that they can make best use of it. They need to keep on top of that, but also support when they sometimes come under scrutiny for, well, why did you do this, or why are you doing this? And having that support mechanism there inside your institution is very important, but equally outside your institution, it's very important as well. And I think here again, you see a difference between the global north and global south, because in the global north, very much, you had a lot of this academic traditions there, and so there was that ability. In the global south, that's less so. So in the global south, you'll see that the private sector is picking up the slack there, which is good, because somebody is helping these public policy bodies who want to do this kind of work, but they've never done it before. They don't necessarily have the skill sets, and they need to bring that in sometimes quickly, which is good. But I think that they also need to start to build some of that academic capacity as well. International organizations have been really good in helping to develop that ecosystem. Certainly at the OECD, where I was, and it continues to do good work doing that. But the World Health Organization has been a real pioneer in the health space. The UN, Save the Children in relation to youth policy. So there's lots of these actors, but it's important to have this ecosystem, because I think that the lesson from some of those behavioral public policy bodies who maybe started off and didn't do so well, or maybe even disappeared, is that it's because they were isolated. They were put into a cupboard, inside their institution, kind of wheeled out every so often in order to do some behavioral work. But they didn't have that ecosystem to help them. And a final point I'll just mention about that ecosystem is that it's also important to have that ecosystem in order for you to develop pathways to scale and develop pathways towards actually implementing the solutions at a bigger level. And if you're not involving others in the journey, in the process, then there's a high likelihood that maybe some of the good work that you do will not get adopted.
Hey Groovers, quick break from the conversation to talk about something we don't bring up enough on the show.
Yeah, that's right. When we're not behind the mic, we're working with organizations to apply behavioral science in ways that actually move the needle for leaders teams, and whole cultures.
So whether it's designing smarter incentives, boosting engagement, setting goals that actually stick, or helping teams navigate change, we bring real science to real workplace challenges.
And we don't just talk theory. Our approach blends research-backed insights with hands-on strategies that drive results. Now, we've seen small behavioral shifts lead to big wins in Fortune 500 companies and scrappy startups and even in mission-driven nonprofits.
Yeah, and we bring the same curiosity, creativity, and care to our client work that we bring to every episode of the show.
Really, I think people might want more than what we bring to the show.
You probably have a point there. You're probably right.
Okay, so we'll bring more care and creativity to our work with you and your teams than what we do on the show.
Yes, more care. So if you're ready to build stronger motivation, better team dynamics, and maybe even make your workplace a little more groovy,
yeah, reach out to us. Grab us on LinkedIn or Facebook, or just drop us a line. We'd love to help you and your team find your groove.
So Faisal, if I understand this right, and correct me if I misunderstood this. So there is the policy team themselves, the internal team that is there, and then there's kind of two different ways that the outside is. One is the academic kind of research institutes and the professors and the people there that can add that outside perspective. But then there's also the private sector. And as you said, Global North and Global South are slightly different in that perspective. Are you seeing, first off, is that correct? And then are you seeing, even in the Global North, and maybe this comes in with that piece that you talked about, the number of agencies that are being built, that it's moving out of academia and more into the private sector, or is that growth happening there as well, or how does that all kind of fit together?
Yeah, that's so. Firstly, your understanding is absolutely correct, Kurt, and you're also right that what I think. So previously, there was back in 2018, there were like 9 private sector entities that were applying behavioral science and able to do it on a regular basis. Now there's almost 100.
Yeah.
And
wow.
I think that's a massive growth. And I think that you're right that what has happened is that this market, if you like, has emerged where public policy officials and governments and regulatory agencies require this skill set, and they require this. And sometimes they need it on tap, or they need it at short notice. But also sometimes they need kind of those fresh ideas and fresh thinking. And they need that. They not only do they need the academic literature and rigor that helps with the ideas, but they need that practitioner know-how as well of how to make it actually happen inside the organization, or how to make it stick inside the institution. So you're right. That emergence has definitely been there, and that's because there's been a lack of the provision of that. And I think through the years, you've had a number of people who have either got that experience and then gone out, or then we've got all these fantastic behavioral science programs that have emerged across the world, and their graduates are coming out, and they're starting to set up practices and starting to do really exciting and cool work, and they're all counted in that 631 that I mentioned that are in the paper.
And the reason actually that struck me was, and Tim and I have had this conversation, is in the private sector, I see a similar kind of mirror piece, is that those private sectors that have set up a behavioral science unit within the bank or within the whatever company, often if they're isolated, they kind of disappear. And this ecosystem that is required isn't necessarily one that they're doing. And when they do, I think they don't use maybe both of the arms. They don't necessarily, they either use an academic component, but then not maybe consultancies, or consultancies and not the academic. And I think there's value, and this is me just pontificating from, my very small little soapbox here, because I don't have a very good view.
Oh, it's a bigger soapbox than very small. It's a pretty good sized soapbox.
All right. So we'll take that. But this idea that I think this ecosystem component has a huge element of bringing in the new technologies as you talked about, but it's also that you said like, oh, you get a leader who reads nudge and all of a sudden I can do behavioral science, and really, you have to have that inside group in order to be saying, well, maybe we need to be thinking about things on a different perspective here and a little deeper than what you just think. So and again, I'll get off my soapbox here and take
No,
the
no, no.
quarter
Carry
of an
on.
inch
No,
step
no, I
down.
like it. Very much preaching to the converted here, but I think there's another point that I put in the paper as well, which is that the ecosystem is incredibly important. But the other missing piece that I've put it into the paper as well, which is that um, building a narrative
Mm,
and storytelling when you're applying behavioral science is so important. I think that the quote I think I have, which is that evidence without a story or a narrative are just numbers with no meaning.
mm,
And I think that one of the problems for a number of the behavioral public policy units is that they almost try and become too technocratic, and they say, okay, look, the numbers will speak for themselves. So they do a fantastic piece of work and it's really good, solid. And then they kind of come to their leaders or the decision makers and go, da here you go. And the leaders turn around to them and say, well, so what? And they don't have an answer for that
Mhm.
because they haven't thought about the narrative. They haven't thought about building the story. They haven't necessarily engaged all of the stakeholders from the start. They haven't built those pathways to scale, which has meant that, unfortunately, then the good work they do sits on the shelf. But you have to connect it to the importance of the institution. So that institutional knowledge is incredibly important. You need to connect it to the leaders and the decision makers.
Mhm.
Um, and it has to make sense. It has to make sense to, okay, we've done this piece of work. So why should we invest resources in order to do whatever it is that you're telling me to do? And that is part of that skill of being a behavioral practitioner, which you're right, sometimes isn't necessarily well understood because people think, look, the numbers will speak for themselves. But we all know that, we're way past that stage of facts meaning everything. So you
yes.
need to build a narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what if you were to put your crystal ball out on the table and peer into the future, Faisal? What do you think the future of behavioral policy looks like in the coming years? Is it
Um,
changing?
so So I'm not sure whether I can give you the crystal ball thing. I think, but I think my hopes and wishes, I think, are that, look, the way that I describe it is that the way that, if you like, behavioral public policy first came about, and was maybe slightly misunderstood, was that it was going to come and it was going to provide a silver bullet for lots of
Mm,
different policies. And by the way,
Yeah.
no behavioral scientist ever or no credible behavioral scientist or behavioral practitioner ever
Right.
sold this
Right.
as a silver bullet, right?
credible being the key
Yeah.
word there.
Yes,
Yes,
But
yes,
I
exactly.
yes.
mean, yeah. This was, I don't know where that myth came from, but that certainly permeates a lot of the corporate world today,
Yeah,
if not the public and the public world as well.
yeah, that's right. And I think that the way that I describe the way that it should be understood is that you're not looking for silver bullets, but you're looking for golden nuggets.
Oh.
And those golden nuggets could come in a failed experiment. They could come in the diagnostics that you do. But there's a permanent need inside institutions and organizations for them to be able to have this capacity to understand human behavior, whether that is the humans that they are inflicting their services on or their products on, or whether it's the human beings that are inside their own organization. But they need to have this capacity. And my hope is that we get to that stage where we are saying that, as well as you have, a finance team, or you have an economics team, or you have a comms team, you need to have some kind of behavioral team that is just a permanent fixture that is adding value to the organization and providing those golden nuggets on a regular basis. And that would be my hope for where things go. And this comes from, having, first of all, helping in the OECD doing behavioral science in different countries, and then applying it to the organization itself, and applying it to how the organization is running, and then doing it in the global south as well. And I think the more that I do this, I think that paradigm shift from we're out here to give you silver bullets, which is the misunderstood version, towards we're here to provide you with golden nuggets, I think is where I would like to see the field go, and where I would like to see many of these behavioral public policy bodies position themselves for their own sustainability, but also so that they can also get into the game more of the real big wicked problems and really adding value to the organizations that they're working for.
Yeah. I love how you state that the golden nugget versus that silver bullet. I think is a very clear, again, as we're talking about the narrative, right? The narrative there is a different narrative than what we talked about. One thing you brought up, and I think we've had this conversation with Steve Martin and a few others on the show about, the future of behavioral science inside organizations or inside public sectors. And that is this idea of, is there a standalone business unit that is behavioral science or behavioral economics? Or, and this isn't an either or, it can be an and, do we permeate the finances, the other human resources, the other aspects within those organizations with a behavioral science knowledge so that they can be more informed? So in other words, it's not that the marketing team has to come to the behavioral science group, but that they have a base knowledge that they are applying. And again, would just love your thoughts on how you see in your ideal world moving forward. What would that be?
So I think so I don't think it's an either or.
Yeah.
And I think that in all the work that I've tried to do, I've always tried to do it in a way to mainstream the practice of conducting behavioral work inside the organizations, whether that's doing things on recruitment with the HR team, or whether it's doing things on cybersecurity with the IT team.
Yeah.
But very much, I think what you want to get to, is you want to get to the stage where most people within the organization and most teams have at least a basic understanding of what the behavioral sciences are telling us and what we're saying, and around, checking our assumptions, debiasing what exactly it is that we're doing, all of those kind of things. But I think that you can also have that, whether it's essential coordinating or whatever it is, or standard setting, or whatever you want to call it, kind of also function that helps to set standards, that helps to jump in and parachute in as and when necessary, because it might not be that you always have those skills at hand. And certainly, because we're doing some difficult stuff, we're trying to figure out human beings.
Yeah.
And human beings change. So you're never going to be doing this as a one shot. It's going to have to be a consistent effort. You're always going to have to carry on doing this. And so as things change, and as we were mentioning, the technologies change, or the context change, or findings change, whatever it is that you need to have that, almost kind of, behavioral intelligence inside the organization, so that you can consistently be doing things that you want to do and have the right outcomes, as opposed to kind of doing things and hoping that they maybe will work.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I didn't, have you answer in a way that was totally opposite of what Tim and I have talked about, because it aligns really well. So I was a decent lawyer today. I kind of knew what the answer would be when I asked that question, but there you go. So
Good. Well, you see, doing your homework is always good, right?
It has its rewards. Let's just say that
Yes.
it definitely has its rewards. Faisal, you introduced us to the term wicked problems. What wicked problems are you working on today?
Ooh. So I'm not sure. So there are various different things. I'm working on things like around population health and obesity, things like around sugar intakes, kind of at the
Wow.
national level, and I think that those kind of wicked problems are very interesting in this kind of debate that we're having around kind of the golden nuggets and kind of tinkering at the edges and things, because I think
Yeah.
that on the one hand, yes, we need to improve things like food labeling and understanding of what's going on, and helping consumers make choices. But equally, ultimately, if we really listen to the science and the evidence, the two things that are really going to work is going to be portion control and availability.
Yeah.
But are governments willing to do the necessary things in order to do that? And I think that the more that I'm kind of working on these wicked problems, I think the more that I'm getting to a stage where we can help and we can shift the dial at the implementation stage. But there are some pretty core fundamentals that governments need to think about. And I just think about myself traveling across the world and going to different places. And whenever I have a look at certain soft drinks, I won't mention them, but they have different amounts of sugar in them depending upon which country you're in.
Oh
And
my gosh.
yeah, and in some places, a sip might give you diabetes. um and
Yeah.
and in other places you can drink a whole bottle and you'll be fine. But why is that the case? And from my kind of, I guess, kind of stepping back global perspective, I kind of wonder, why is it that in some countries they're able to get a grip onto some of these things at a fundamental level, in other places it's more difficult? And yes, again, the politics and the power, and the power of industry is very important. But I think that those are kind of things that are really beginning to go into my mind about, do we need to have a more concerted global effort on this
Yeah.
kind of thing, as opposed to each country trying to take a bite out of these wicked problems at a time.
Well, you
Wow.
talked earlier this idea that, behavioral science looks at behaviors, but also what you're saying is sometimes the behaviors we can only change them or influence them so much. There's only so much that we can do on that back end. And so from a global perspective, I love this idea of thinking about things more globally, to say maybe we have to look at the inputs, and maybe we have to think about, if we want this outcome, if we want a healthier, longer living population that isn't having diabetes or being obese or various different pieces, what are the inputs that we can influence? And to that point, I did not know that there was differences outside of Mexico, because I know that we can order in the US a Mexican Coke, and comes still in the old glass bottle, and it uses actual cane sugar as opposed to the corn fructose that they
Right.
have, and it tastes different. And it's
Yeah,
a special treat when
yeah,
I get to use that. But other than that, I didn't know that there was differences across the globe. So yeah.
yeah. No,
Well,
absolutely.
yeah, it reminds me. I actually just read a paper on the I-frame versus S-frame. Nick Chater
Yeah,
and of course, George Lowenstein brought up this I-frame versus S-frame, the individual versus the systematic kind of framing of nudges, and it posed this question about the big opposing factor in developing um, these global or larger scale problems is neoliberalism. It's this as a social concept, like this idea that you can't take away my individual freedom
yeah,
to make a choice. You need to give me that choice, and I'll suffer the consequences. And the counter argument, of course, is that the consequences are societal.
yeah,
They're not just individual. The cost of healthcare, for instance, is borne by hundreds of millions of people, not just that one person. And so I'm really heartened by the fact, Faisal, that you're going after this monstrous, absolutely wicked problem. We will come back and talk to you about that more. But right now, we need to find out: do you have a go-to playlist? is there some music in your life that you have sort of a go-to, like, I need a juice of, need to get fueled up with some music? Is there a place that you go, and what's on that playlist?
So I have quite a wide variety of kind of, I guess, go-tos. But again, right, we should know this kind of doing the behavioral science, because it very much depends upon context, right? It depends upon my mood, depends
Yes.
upon how I'm feeling, depends upon what I'm going to go and do. So if I want to kind of, be more in a meditative state, then, someone like, Abdul Rahman al-Sudais comes to mind, or then someone like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, kind of much more kind of spiritual, kind of getting you in the zone. But if I'm going to play football and I want some hype music, then, I'm going to play some UK grime like Kano, or someone else like Dizzy Rascal or something. I'm not sure if any of these mean anything to you guys. But then again, if I'm in a very mellow state, I love to, listen to kind of Trojan records or Bob Marley, and kind of that kind of reggae stuff. And then I think kind of, if there was one song that just kind of settles me down, I think it's probably Jill Scott's Long Walk. I think just putting that on and just kind of just
Wow.
listening to it is just very, very calming and smoothing. So a wide variety there for you, not just kind of one thing. And there's probably a few other kind of genres, like kind of reggaeton or bhangra as well, that's in there. So I have a wide variety and kind of interest. But like I said, it depends upon my context.
Of course. Context matters. The
Yes.
the absolute triumph there. Faisal, it is such a treat to have you as a guest on Behavioral Groups today. It's good to see you again.
Great to see you both, and an absolute pleasure. And I thoroughly enjoy the work that you guys are doing. So, please keep it up. I think it's a great contribution towards the entire behavioral community as well. So, a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Faisal, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our non-isolated island brains.
Get us into an ecosystem, right?
Yes.
Let us thrive in community. Humans do this so well, right? Is that kind of where you're headed with that?
Well, we could be doing a podcast where we're solo, but no, we get each other here. We are not an island unto ourselves. We are a community. We are an ecosystem of not just you and me, but we also have Caroline, and then we have all of our guests, and we
That's
have
true.
our supporters and our Groove community Facebook page, and a variety of different things. And we're better because of that. In my mind, we are better because of that ecosystem that really helps in making sure that we are on top of our game, that we have the knowledge and the information and the processes and everything else that is required to make this happen.
I couldn't agree more. And let's talk about ecosystems here for just a minute, right? I mean, when I think about ecosystems and I think about the environment that we grew up in, I remember having a conversation with Kuhn Smets about growing up in Denmark and like what it was like, or Belgium. Excuse me, he's from Belgium, and like what it was like how else could he kind of said something like, how else could you not see the world from the perspective of moats and swamps and low-lying, beaches, areas on the sea when you grew up with that? Like that,
Yeah.
that just is familiar and normal and easily accessible to you.
Was Koen from Belgium, or was he from the Netherlands?
I think it's Belgium.
Okay.
Gosh.
Oh. Well,
okay.
You know what? Koen, if you're listening, let us know. All right, we're sorry. We're sorry. We should know this. But you're right. I mean, there's this aspect of, and I remember that conversation with Koen, the difference if you had grown up in Switzerland in mountains versus along a coastal flat area. And it has to shape your worldview. And I think there's also an element of this in the ecosystems, and just again thinking about this, it's context. Context is also the social norms with which you're growing up. I remember I just heard or read a thing about the like clothing, and you look at clothing and they're like going, you can trace clothing back to the environment that it people and the community that people have been built in, and they were specifically looking at people in hot areas. So they looked at the kind of dress that people wore in Saudi Arabia. And because they didn't have many fibers or other things, they used a lot of wool, right? They used this. So you're going, it's hot, you're using wool, but actually, wool is a pretty good insulator against the heat coming in and different things. But you go to India, in India, they used a lot of like lighter silk cottony type kind of things. And again, very hot, but it was humid there. So again, the context changed even the dress that they had given the heat and different pieces of it. So
yeah, or the bread that comes. Bread is universal to all humankind, right? The kind of bread that was produced in Asia was different from the kind of bread that was produced in Africa, which was different from the kind of bread produced in all the different European countries. Have different approaches. Every country sort of has its own take on bread. So this context, the ecosystem that is influencing our behaviors is significant. And
yeah.
and the thing about ecosystems also, more than just ecological systems, but about human systems, is that they're constantly changing. Like
Mm,
power dynamics and cultural shifts are constantly changing. And because of that, policies change as well.
yeah.
So there is something to be thinking about in terms of what matters today in a global economy is different than what mattered 80 years ago or 100 years ago.
Or even 10 years ago. I
Yeah,
mean, if you look
yeah,
at the rate of change today, it's so vastly different. And the interconnectedness of the world today versus even 10, 20 years ago. And all of that fits into this ecosystem, which impacts those things. And so it's really interesting to see that component of this and Faisal talking about that. But there is an aspect of, hey, if you are building, I mean, think about the different areas inside of just the United States. You have Silicon Valley, and what's there? Tech companies.
lots of
It's
tech
not
companies.
not
Yep.
just one tech company, not just a couple big ones. There's hundreds of tech companies and startups that are being built there because there is an ecosystem there. There are people who have that
That's right.
experience. There are the venture funding, organizations that are there. There is actual infrastructure that helps with making that happen. Twin Cities, is a medical device hub. There are,
That's
you
right.
know, dozens of medical device companies. Again, same reasons. You look out pharmaceutical in New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, and that area has a whole bunch of pharmaceutical. There are ecosystems that create the and support types of industries. And I think, again, as we're talking about behavioral science, you need an ecosystem to help support that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment, Kurt. And I just want to also just sort of add in my own sort of issue from social side. Robert Livingston, when we were talking to him in episode 321, we were talking about affirmative action,
Mm,
and this definitely fits into the ecosystem discussion because he said white men have had affirmative action for the last 250 years, and that's largely because it was white men who were in power. They continued to promote other people who looked and acted like them and were from sort of familiar classes, and basically they kind of kept this ecosystem going for many generations, regrettably excluding great talent from people who just didn't look like them.
right. And part of that ecosystem then drives the social norms, right? So the as we're thinking about the behaviors that we elicit and the thought patterns that we elicit, which are driven by the predominant norms of the community or the society that we are in.
Yeah.
And that then changes because of the ecosystem that is there. So, I think we've talked with Christina Bicchieri talking about, how social norms impact our behaviors, but as an individual, our behaviors impact the social norms. It's this yin
Right.
yang.
Right.
And so the
Yeah.
ecosystem impacts the social norms, and then the social norms impact the ecosystem in the
Yeah.
same similar way. You can see that happening.
Let's talk a little bit about Faisal's comment around the global south tackling the wicked problems and sort of implying that the global north is not coasting along, but going after more incremental projects, right? And that this might be stemming from this idea that in the global north, making incremental progress is easier because of sort of where the cultures are, compared to the global south, where there's a lot of stress and challenge and combustion in the systems, and so making great strides forward is sort of necessary if you're going to apply behavioral science to it. And I think that those are that there's a lot of evidence of that there certainly is evidence of that taking place.
Well, I think there's evidence of from a policy perspective that, hey, global South countries may perceive that there is a greater potential gain, and as a part of that, less to lose by going big on behavioral science, right?
Yeah.
On
Hmm.
structural issues like poverty and health, and even kind of foregoing all of the traditional approaches, which have definitely underdelivered over the years. I do have an issue, though, because I don't think that the global north has avoided those, maybe from a policy issue, maybe from a governmental component, but there are great behavioral scientists researching global climate change,
Yeah.
researching scarcity and poverty and a wide variety of factors that go into food deserts and a variety of other things. So these are not small incremental problems. They are researching the big issues. And so I don't think that it's the fact that they're not looking at it. It may not have the same overall feel. And there are just probably more people in the global north. And so you might have to look at, the differences between height and the impact on how you perceive your leadership capabilities and different pieces of that, right?
Well,
Or
I think you've
small nudges of getting people to pee in their urinal as opposed to not in
making a
their
splash.
urinal. Yeah.
Well, we can also look at behavioral change for good. The Katie Milkman, Angela Duckworth organization, doing these monstrous global studies. That's
Yeah.
they're looking at major problems. They tackled some serious vaccine issues during the pandemic, and
Vaccine, weight loss. I mean,
wait, yeah,
obesity is a huge issue. So
yeah. So
exercise. Yeah.
so that certainly exists in the North, and although there was sort of this idea that in the global North we're sort of tinkering at the margins. Fadi Maki, from Nudge Lebanon, told us about a story of how they were working desperately on trying to get people to stop at a stop sign. So,
Yeah. So
I
again, not all global south issues are wicked problems.
no,
Not all global north ones are non-wicked
no,
problems. I think
but
there's a
sir,
mix. But the
yeah,
two Faisal's, perspective, I think the global south feels, at least, like those are wicked problems and they have to solve them. And I think there's
yeah,
more of a urgency to solve these problems that isn't there in the north. The north doesn't have that, hey, well, take away where we are currently in today's world, but that we don't have these issues where our society is going to fail because we
right.
don't have enough food, we don't have the whatever it would be. And I think there's some element of that comes into play.
Agreed. Certainly, there is a sharp economic calculus that the global south is dealing with that is shaped by constraints that,
Yes.
of course, is going to influence those cultures and those countries in a more significant way than most typical global north organizations.
And with that wonderful kind of point that you had there, Tim, let's wrap things up. What do you say?
Okay, that sounds good. And it's kind of surprised that I actually had like the last epistle on that. That's sort of rare, but that's kind of amazing. And I want to reiterate the fantastic comment about golden nuggets versus silver bullets. I just have to just say that I love that idea. This perspective shift really could impact many organizations. So I just want you to think about maybe you've been searching for silver bullets when in fact you should be digging for golden nuggets. Leaders could, right? Yeah. So
fantastic metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Let's look for the golden nuggets. Let's not try to find the silver bullet that's going to, make that issue go away. We can, it's like, let's expand the pie instead of just figuring out how to cut the pie up and distribute it evenly. So there you go.
Exactly.
All right. Speaking of benefits, Tim, you know what else our listeners might benefit from?
Is this a tee up to our Substack newsletter?
You read my mind, Mr. Houlihan, or you just read the script, whichever one it was. I don't know. Our Behavioral Groove Substack delivers weekly insights, curated research, cool new music insights, and exclusive content that doesn't make it to the podcast. It's a great way to stay in touch. And if that is not on your Behavioral Groove bucket list, then definitely you should be joining our Behavioral Grooves community on Facebook, because I'm sure that is on your bucket list, right?
That's right. So if you enjoyed our conversation with Faisal about behavioral science and public policy, you'll love the deep dives into how these same principles apply across business, health, personal development, and more. And all that gets discussed in the Facebook community, and it's going to show up in the Substack newsletter, both of them.
Yeah. So just head over to bgpodcast.substack.com to subscribe to the newsletter, the Substack newsletter. It's free, though we do offer a premium tier for those who would like to support our endeavor and make sure that we actually can afford to pay our producer and all the people who work behind the scenes, even though it comes out of our pocketbooks right now. Maybe you can help share in that thing as we go forward. And then go out to Facebook and just search Behavioral Groove community, and you should find that in the group out there. So
yeah. And be sure to join us on Monday, May 26th, when we release our discussion with neuroscientist Emily Falk about how our brains process the things that we value. Awesome.
It's a great episode. So encourage everybody to listen and prepare for that. Until then, we hope you take some golden nuggets from our discussion with Faisal and use them this week as you go out and find your groove.